A female pilot, losing control of her fighter aircraft while gliding toward the Sierra Nevada mountains, had only one thought running through her mind. Mother was right, the sky isn't for women. So what did the search and rescue team find in her bag 3 days later when they discovered her half dead on the mountainside that made all of America start talking about this story? And how did this young pilot from Texas manage to survive on just a handful of biscuits and one chocolate bar?
My name is Betty Wilson, and I feel lucky to be able to tell you this story. Because in November 1943, on the cold and merciless peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains, there were only a few hours between me and death. I was 22 years old back then and part of the Women Airforce Service Pilots program, known as WASP. My hair was chestnut brown and reached down to my shoulders. I was constantly trying to fix the strands that came out from under my pilot helmet. I was average height with an athletic build, because we trained 5 hours every day back then. My eyes were green, and my father always used to say, "Betty's eyes are just like the Texas prairies, endless." I remember that day. I had my brown leather gloves on. I was wearing my dark blue WASP uniform, and my boots were tightly laced. On that cold November morning, I was standing next to the P-51D Mustang aircraft waiting for me at the Douglas factory in Long Beach. This aircraft was silver and gleaming, with Miss Liberty written on the engine cowl, a brand new fighter plane I had never flown before. My mission was simple: safely deliver this aircraft to Nellis Air Base in Nevada. At 6 in the morning, I was standing next to the aircraft, doing pre-flight checks. Even a November morning in California was colder than a June day in Texas. My breath was coming out as vapor. My hands were numb despite the gloves. When I started the aircraft engine, I heard that familiar Merlin engine sound, like a huge cat meowing, but much more powerful and encouraging. The last weather report I received from the airport control tower was good. Light winds, clear visibility, a smooth flight to Nevada was expected. Weather reports weren't very reliable back then, but that's what we had. I took off from the runway at 7:30. The aircraft was climbing so smoothly I felt like I was floating in the air. The P-51's controls were very sensitive, responding to even the slightest touch. The compass on my instrument panel was pointing toward Nevada, and my radio was on. Everything was perfect. For the first hour, I experienced no problems. I was watching the California deserts below, yellow and brown colors blending together, small towns appearing occasionally. My altitude was 10,000 feet, and my speed was around 300 miles per hour. In those moments, I felt like the luckiest person in the world.
However, as I approached the Nevada border, I began to notice dark clouds coming from the east. At first I didn't pay much attention because my altitude was above the clouds. But the clouds were constantly rising and expanding, as if they were a living creature.
Around 9 o'clock I started hearing the first crackling sounds on my radio. When I said Nellis Base, "This is Liberty," reporting my position, the voice coming back was very distorted. The radio operator said, "Betty, I can barely hear you." Repeat, but I could barely hear him too. 10 minutes later, my radio went completely silent. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get any sound out. That's when I felt a slight uneasiness for the first time. But my compass was still working, and my fuel situation was good. Around 10 o'clock, things really started to get bad. The clouds coming from the east had caught up with me and my visibility was rapidly decreasing. First I couldn't see the deserts below. Then I could barely make out the tip of my nose cone. The clouds were so thick it was like flying through piles of cotton. When I looked at my compass, I noticed something horrifying. The needle was constantly spinning. The magnetic storm had affected the compass and I no longer knew which direction I was going. My heart started beating rapidly and my palms were sweating inside the gloves. "Stay calm, Betty," I told myself. We had trained extensively for such situations in WASP training, but real life was never like training. I saw a worrying drop in my fuel gauge. I now had 2 hours of fuel left and had no idea where I was. I decided to descend. Maybe I could see something below the clouds. When I descended to 5,000 feet, I emerged from the clouds, but the landscape I saw was nothing like I had hoped. There were mountains everywhere. Sharp, snow-capped peaks surrounded me. These were the Sierra Nevada mountains, and I was much further west than planned, in a much more dangerous area. I began to feel panic. My breathing quickened. My hands were trembling. "No, Betty, pull yourself together," I said out loud. I felt like I could hear my father's voice. "Daughter, when you're in trouble, first breathe, then think." Looking down, I started searching for a flat area. But everywhere was either covered with steep slopes or filled with pine forests. The fuel gauge was now showing the red zone. I had 30 minutes left, maybe 40. That's when the emergency landing procedures from WASP training came to mind. I could hear my instructor Margaret Thompson's voice echoing in my ears. "Girls, losing your aircraft is not a problem. Losing yourself is the problem." For about 20 minutes I searched for a suitable landing area. My heartbeat was so fast I thought my chest would burst. Finally, I found a relatively flat-looking small valley between two mountains. It wasn't very ideal, but I had no other choice. As I turned for landing, I noticed the aircraft was icing up. My wings and glass surfaces were covered with a layer of ice. This made controlling the aircraft even more difficult. Every movement had now become a risk. As I began my landing approach, I realized how severe the wind was. The aircraft was swaying left and right, as if invisible hands were pulling it around. My altimeter readings were rapidly decreasing: 1,000 feet, 800 feet, 600 feet. At 300 feet, I saw large rocks in front. I had to clear these, but it wasn't possible at that speed. I cut the throttle and pulled the aircraft's nose up. That's when something went wrong. The aircraft lost control and began tilting to the right. "No, no, no," I screamed and pulled the control stick to the left. But it was too late. The aircraft was getting lower and going out of control. The pine trees below were rapidly growing larger. At the last moment I managed to straighten the aircraft a bit, but the landing was very hard. First the tail section hit the ground, then the nose. The aircraft bounced, hit the ground again, and after sliding about 100 meters, it stopped at the base of a pine tree. My head hit the controls and my vision went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I opened my eyes, I noticed blood coming from my nose. There was terrible pain in my left leg and I couldn't move it. I was surrounded by silence. I could only hear the wind passing through the pine trees and the distant sound of snowflakes hitting the aircraft's windscreen. Snow had started falling. My first task was to assess my situation. I had a fracture in my left leg, a large swelling on my head, cuts on my right hand, but I was alive. I tried to get out of the aircraft cockpit, but the cabin door was stuck. After struggling for about half an hour, I managed to open the door. When I stepped outside, the cold pierced me like a knife. Due to the altitude effect, the air was very thin, and breathing became difficult. Looking around, I found myself in a small clearing, completely surrounded by pine forests. I had no idea where the nearest sign of civilization might be. I went back to the aircraft and got the emergency bag. Inside were 2 chocolate bars, a handful of biscuits, several candles, matches, water purification tablets, and a small blanket. Who knows how long I could last with these supplies. I spent the first night inside the aircraft. As the engine cooled, the aircraft made noisy sounds. The wind was shaking the metal body. I couldn't sleep from the pain in my leg and constantly listened to the sounds coming from outside. I was afraid there might be bears or wolves. When morning came, the snow thickness had increased. Since I couldn't stand on my foot, I had to crawl to move around. I tried to warm up by lighting the candles in my bag, but the candles melted very quickly. The second day was a bit harder. The feeling of hunger was twisting my stomach, and I had only eaten half a chocolate bar. Finding water required melting snow, but this took a lot of energy. My leg condition was getting worse. The swelling was increasing. I spent that night counting stars. I was remembering my childhood in Texas, sitting with my father on the farm porch, watching the sky, recalling how he taught me the constellations. "My Betty," he would say, "the stars always show the way home." On the third day I was beginning to despair. My chocolate was finished. Only a few biscuit crumbs remained. But that morning I heard a strange sound. It sounded like an engine. At first I thought I was imagining it. The sound was getting closer. I crawled near my aircraft and lit my remaining candles. To make the smoke visible, I burned everything I had: the pilot's maps, emergency manual, even the ribbon I used to tie my hair. Then I saw it. An orange-colored Piper J-3 Cub aircraft was circling above the valley. It was a search and rescue aircraft. I cried from joy so much that my tears started freezing on my cheeks. The aircraft must have seen me because it started descending. The pilot landed the aircraft in a safe area nearby. 2 people got out of the aircraft, a search and rescue specialist and a paramedic. The first person to come was a man named John Martinez, in his 40s, with brown hair and a cheerful face. When he approached me, he said, "Miss Wilson, we're very happy to have found you." There was so much compassion in his voice that I started crying again. The paramedic examined my leg and made a simple splint. "You're lucky. The fracture is simple. But there's a risk of infection," he said. They gave me hot soup and sandwiches. I will never forget the taste at that moment. John told me about the search and rescue operation. "We've been looking for you for 3 days," he said. "Your family was very worried. Your mother calls every day. Your father was getting ready to come to California too." As I was being loaded into the rescue aircraft, I turned back and looked at my P-51 one last time. That beautiful aircraft was stranded there among the pine trees. But thanks to that aircraft, I was alive. It had tried to protect me until the very end. When I was taken to the hospital, my first task was to call my family. When I heard my mother's voice, we both cried. "My Betty, you will never fly an aircraft again," she said, but there was pride in her voice too. I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. During this time my leg healed, but the psychological effects lasted longer. I couldn't sleep at night. I kept thinking I heard engine sounds. But I noticed something else. This experience had made me stronger. I had come face to face with death and survived. I knew that I would never be so afraid of anything again. When I returned to the WASP program, the other female pilots welcomed me like a hero. But I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt lucky. After this incident, I remained in the WASP program and continued my duty until the war ended. I flew a total of 150 more hours, but none were as memorable as that November day.
Betty Wilson's incredible story was not just one woman's struggle for survival, but also an example of the courage and determination of thousands of WASP pilots who quietly served in America's skies during that period. After spending 3 days in the cold mountains of the Sierra Nevada, Betty realized that for the rest of her life, there would be nothing she couldn't overcome. Today, at 102 years old, Betty still lives in her home in Texas, and her grandson calls her the flying grandmother.